And very in line with our theme, we do have our sponsor of the day who would like to come up in a moment and say a few words. We have Angelique from South Florida Commuter Services.
Thank you, Roya, and again, good morning to everybody. It's been such a pleasure being here these 3 days and getting to hear from some of our wonderful keynote speakers and getting to know a little bit more about each and every one of you. But South Florida Commuter Services is a program of Florida Department of Transportation. We primarily deal with District 4 and District 6, which is all the way down to the Keys, all the way up to Martin County. It's pretty inclusive so far. And we work on some things such as encouraging people to get out of single occupancy vehicles and encourage the use of transportation. How do we do that? Park and rides, carpool, van pool, even work from home and flexible work schedules. And we really encourage everybody to use these types of transportation. And we also advocate for different park and rides in the area to kind of reach some of those populations that maybe don't have one of those transit hubs. But it's been such a pleasure to be here and sponsor this kind of event, and so I'm really excited to see what our speakers have to say about transportation today. Again, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. I had the pleasure of working with the commuter services program for a few years, and I know, being a program of FDOT, they really do a lot of really good things to help mobility in South Florida. So now I would love to have the CNU Florida President, Rick Geller, introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Roya. Doing passenger rail in Florida is very challenging, to say the least. Fort Lauderdale had a very unfortunate experience very recently. And Tampa has had its struggles, including an adverse decision from the Florida Supreme Court, struck down funding for the expansion of rail. Back when I first came to Florida in the late 1990s, the Orange County Commission, in probably what was the dumbest decision ever in the history of local government, turned down funding for a robust light rail system. So you can visit Orlando's light rail system today in Charlotte, North Carolina. And then, of course, there was high-speed rail. Funding was all there, and Governor Scott said, no thanks, we don't want it. And so I thought it would be appropriate to bring to you a speaker who had a remarkable success in the field of rail transit. Now let me back up a little bit. I'm a native of Cincinnati. And when I was growing up, there was a neighborhood, and John Schneider, our speaker, is going to tell you about Over the Rhine. This was a part of town where it was understood that suburban white guys like me would never go there. Seriously. We're talking an area of incredible disinvestment. And actually, if you were to go to Amazon Prime, there's a movie called Traffic, and it was where Michael Douglas plays the drug czar. And his daughter gets addicted to drugs, and she becomes a prostitute. And she's working out of this abandoned building in Over the Rhine in Cincinnati. If you want to see what Over the Rhine was like back then, look at that movie. And so, how do you bring back an area like Over the Rhine? Well, I had a conversation with John Norquist, who is the former national director of the CNU. This was several years ago when John was working on bringing rail transit back to Cincinnati. And John told me that the last time there was population growth in the core of Cincinnati was when Cincinnati had a rail car system. And he predicted that if John was successful, there would be growth again. And he was right. So a little bit about John. He's a native of Indianapolis. He was educated at the University of Cincinnati with a BS in economics and went on to get a master's degree in public administration, I believe. And then after school, he began renovating apartments. He right now has a company. It is called First Valley Holdings, and they develop office buildings. He is a true urbanist at heart. He's lived in downtown Cincinnati for 45 years. And when the corporate titans of Cincinnati came together and founded an organization called Downtown Cincinnati Incorporated, they needed someone to be in charge of their transportation committee. Well, they looked around the room, and there was just one person in the room who rode the bus, and that was John Schneider. And so John thereupon became the chair of the Transportation Committee, and that's what gave rise to his interest in this area. This is a remarkable story you're about to hear. Would you all please welcome John Schneider?
Well, thank you, Rick, after that introduction. I hope it's not all downhill from here. I spent a lot of time the last few days walking around your beautiful city of West Palm Beach. I think I walked every street. Closer? All right. And just as somebody who knows a little bit about rail, I see wide, straight streets with no hills, and I think, wow, you could put streetcars on those streets. So I think hopefully there's some applicability to what I'm talking about. Some of the things that Rick talked about, I'm sure the Tampa project is going to go forward. I'm guessing the President's infrastructure bill, if we live that long to see it passed, will cause some money to flow to Tampa to finish that extension they're talking about, which will be great. Their ridership is very strong. It might have doubled or tripled maybe over the last couple of years. Fort Lauderdale, I used to go to rail and streetcar conventions. There are such things. And I used to hear about the Fort Lauderdale streetcar, and some of you know the story. A new mayor got elected with some new council members and crashed the project, and I thought, that seems familiar to me. I think I lived in a city where that happened. So let me tell you about my city. Winston Churchill said it was the most beautiful of the inland cities of the Union. Often called a city of 7 hills, Cincinnati is really a city of valleys. Multiple waves of climatic change, of warming and cooling, kind of sculpted and rearranged the Midwestern landscape. It formed Lake Erie and created countless valleys, one of which is the Ohio River, which the Native Americans called the Great River. It's really a beautiful place. People seeking new lives floated down that river and established Cincinnati in 1788. It was a frontier boomtown, the Austin of its day. It grew to be the 6th largest city in the United States within 50 years. This is really going to be hard for me here. Okay, no, wrong way, I'm sorry.
Would you like me to change the slide?
You know, that might be good, yeah. Yeah,
Just say
good.
next slide.
Yeah, okay, all right. The Cincinnati, next slide, yeah. Cincinnati's central basin attracted European immigrants to an area separated from downtown by a canal that connected Cincinnati to Lake Erie. That's, up Toledo, Cleveland, that area. Many of the settlers were Germans, and the canal reminded them of the Rhine River. Crossing over the canal reminded them of going over the Rhine, and that neighborhood became known, and it still is known today, as Over the Rhine. Confident that Ohio River steamboats were the future, Cincinnati discounted the value of the railroads and soon lost its influence to Chicago and to Cleveland. In the 1920s, in an effort to get Cincinnati residents to jobs that were growing outside the core, Cincinnati built a subway. They actually drained the canal and put the subway in the canal bed. That project had tremendous cost overruns. This is in the 1920s. There was high inflation, and it was never completed. Progressives used the subway debacle as a means to dismantle the corrupt Republican administration. 90 years later, conservatives used Cincinnati's modern streetcar as a wedge issue to try to drive the Democrats out of office. They failed, and that decade-long civic argument is the subject of my talk to you today. Next slide, please. In 1993, Mayor Roxanne Qualls was elected. Let's see, go back one, I'm sorry. Can you go back one more? Yeah, I'm sorry. In 1993, Mayor Roxanne Qualls was elected and set Cincinnati on a path of continuous improvement, which continues today. We narrowed Interstate 71, you can see that right here, by half of its former width, from 750 feet to 375 feet. We extended the downtown street grid at 5 points across that to reconnect downtown with the riverfront that had been severed in the 1950s by the freeway construction. Guided by Urban Design Associates, you've probably heard of them, we built a huge riverfront park that will someday total $2 billion in development around it. We rebuilt or renovated every public school in our city, and now we're doing the same with our libraries. Our population has grown for the first time in 70 years. By the way, the streetcars went away in 1951. 70 years later, the population is back up again. We have the streetcars back. And our unemployment rate is less than the national and Ohio averages. Although the city of Cincinnati proper is the nation's 65th largest city, it's tied for 10th for having the most Fortune 500 companies. Greater Cincinnati is now the largest area in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana with 2.3 million people, and we, in many ways, punch well above our weight class. It's not all good news about Cincinnati. After a riot in 2001, the Cincinnati Police Department reformed and set about improving its relationship with the black community. They made good progress for a while, but there's been some backsliding over the last few years. And in the last year, 3 of 9 city council members were indicted for taking bribes in development deals. One of them is in prison. Next slide, please. Cincinnatians in the know credit former Mayor Roxanne Qualls with redefining the terms of trade for establishing how our city can prosper. I remember sitting in a city planning commission when just one day she matter-of-factly said, "We now know a city resident is more valuable to the city than a city worker who lives in the suburbs." And that view is widely shared today and is kind of the essential truth behind Cincinnati's comeback, and it's one of the reasons we invested in a $148 million modern streetcar. The reasoning here is simple. Cincinnati is an earnings tax-based city. Most cities in Ohio are. And it gets much of its income from city workers who live in the suburbs. But since people spend their paychecks where they live, the city doesn't get a lot of that spending. And it's private spending that drives investment, which drives employment. And so the idea is to try to recapture some of the spending from those paychecks. And with many employees able to work from home these days, that's becoming even more important. Next slide, please. Christopher Lineberger, anybody know of him? You know of him? Yeah, okay. He's a former developer, a Brookings Fellow, and a professor at the University of Michigan. He helped to refocus our city in the early 2000s. He researched what he called walkable urban places. Places where you can fulfill the daily needs of life within a small footprint. Places like Over the Rhine, which is in the foreground of this photo here. Because of their scale and mix of building types and uses, Lineberger found that downtown adjacent neighborhoods were likely to be the most walkable. Again, downtown in the background, Over the Rhine here in the foreground. He also found that many of those neighborhoods, I think he studied 150 of them across the country, he found that many of them were served by rail. And so those of us interested in bringing streetcars in Cincinnati, we made a note of that. Next slide, please. Around the time Lineberger presented his findings, Cincinnati, the big employers in Cincinnati, formed the Cincinnati, this is hard to say, Cincinnati Center City Development Corporation. It is a tongue twister. I had to take a drink. That's 3CDC for short. The idea was to try to bring patient capital to the idea of making Cincinnati a better place. The word on the street was that our large employers, Procter & Gamble, you've heard of them, Kroger, I don't know if you have them down here, Macy's, probably heard of them, and a bunch of our other large employers were having trouble getting young people to move to Cincinnati. So they hired a gifted city builder named Steve Leeper to lead the effort, and he's been here now about 15 years, and he's the major factor behind downtown and Over the Rhine's comeback. 3CDC bought, they're very strategic, they bought troubled buildings and key sites that they thought would be important to develop in the future. They would typically sell off the upper floors of the buildings they bought and retain the first floors for their own portfolio. They wouldn't lease to national tenants in those spaces because they didn't want our city to look like every other city, and they're still continuing. I mean, I think we have one or two national tenants in Over the Rhine in the areas they've worked, but probably 100 others are all locals. Much of the commercial space went to bars and restaurants. Some people would say too much of it went to bars and restaurants. And 3CDC hasn't escaped criticism. They've been accused of promoting displacement, certainly gentrification in the area of Over the Rhine. Next slide, please. Cincinnati Streetcar was born from the ashes of a crushing defeat. In 2002, Hamilton County taxpayers were asked to approve a ballot initiative that would have built 50 miles of light rail, a modern streetcar, and a massive expansion of our bus system. It was a bad time, 2002, the nation was going to war, gas prices were very low at the time. We'd had some mini scandal like cost overruns on Paul Brown Stadium where the Bengals play. It lost by 2-1 countywide, but in Over the Rhine and downtown, it won by 2-1. We made a note of that too. Looking back on that, we clearly failed to define our objectives in that ballot issue. We were rushed, we really weren't ready. We tried to cover all the bases. We talked about congestion reduction, environmental benefits, urban revitalization, making Cincinnati a 21st century city. There was really no unified, compelling message that people could really hang their hat on. But you know, failure is a great teacher. And we realized we needed to become more focused if we wanted to advance this agenda. We found out through some polling that the concept of urban rail was kind of vague to people. Although Cincinnati once had 200 miles of streetcars, few people alive remembered them. And those who did remember them as noisy, sparky, uncomfortable kinds of things. Nothing that you'd probably want to bring back these days. So I figured, you know, if we could get some people on some airplanes and take them to a city that had streetcars, maybe we could start to turn the conversation. Next slide, please. So Portland had recently opened, this is early 2000s, 2001, had recently opened its streetcar line. It was the first one in the United States. With its hills, rivers, and valleys, Portland, you know, kind of sort of seemed like Cincinnati. Plus the wine was excellent. So we started taking people to Portland. 506 people on 35 trips over 13 years. We invited a highly diverse, highly networked group of people who lived all over the city and region and sometimes beyond. We found a friendly 4-star hotel that gave us ridiculously low rates, and Portland's influentials opened their doors to us. We met with streetcar managers, elected officials, planners, architects, developers, cultural leaders, shopkeepers, even the Portland Trailblazers. And we chatted up the passengers on the trains. Charlie Hales of HDR, you probably know that firm, who later became mayor of Portland and is shown here on the left, and Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer met with our group many, many times. This was a highly effective and somewhat inefficient way of communicating a story of civic success that was achieved partly through better transportation. We converted skeptics into supporters and supporters into champions. Next slide, please. On one of the early trips to Portland, the Dean of Cincinnati Architects said to me, he said, "John, I don't think you're talking about transportation here. I think you're talking about placemaking." I made a note of that too. In 2005, Cincinnati elected a pro-transit mayor, Mark Mallory. That's him in the suit. He always wears a suit to the left, center left of the photo. He was a former state senator with Washington connections. He was a big picture guy whose administration was an incubator of big ideas. He knew interest in downtown. A downtown streetcar was percolating, and he called me up and wanted to talk about it. So we met in a Grater's ice cream store. If you know Grater's, if you can get it down here, I recommend the raspberry chocolate chip. You should go out and buy a pint today. I see some smiles. You know it, right? Okay, all right. So Mallory really got City Hall engaged. They were in with both feet into the streetcar. Next slide, please. So people started drawing lines on their map. That's what planners do. Everybody had their own map, and people started drawing the lines where the streetcar should go. Well, coincidentally, they all pretty much coincided with each other. The destinations were obvious. A few blocks south of the downtown, across the narrowed Interstate 71, we were trying to redevelop our riverfront. At the other end of the basin, and over the Rhine, it was still an urbanist sort of pipe dream. I mean, some work had been done there, but it was really kind of limited. So Cincinnati's emerging new riverfront on the left here, and over the Rhine's Findlay Market on the right, that's the most diverse place in Cincinnati on a Saturday morning, they became the two poles of the streetcar alignment. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the streetcar. It's about 1.8 miles end to end, 3.6 miles of track. Within 2 blocks of the line, there's lots of new and renovated housing, offices, and retail. Two-thirds of our region's major cultural attractions, 3 parks, all of which have been renovated, the nexus of our regional bus network, the homes of the Cincinnati Reds and the Bengals in Major League Soccer, a nationally recognized K-12 school, a new Kroger store, headquarters of 5 Fortune 500 companies, and one of the busiest libraries in the United States. The streetcar would connect a lot of dots in our city. There was something in this for everyone, and because we'd done so much stakeholder outreach early on, no interested party, nobody, ever questioned the route, except some people who wanted to make it longer, which of course we couldn't afford at the time. But so by defining our objectives as reinvestment and repopulation and aligning those objectives with broader community interests, the planning process was remarkably smooth. There was literally no conflicts in the planning process. At its core, next slide please. At its core, Cincinnati Streetcar is a housing strategy. The cost of owning a car in the United States is about $10,000 a year. We also did research, and we found that Cincinnatians at the time spent more on local transportation than almost any other city in the country. I'm talking cities like Houston, Oklahoma City, Phoenix, places like that. We were in the, I don't know, low to 20s to 25%, somewhere in that range. So we believe that if we could redirect some of that money spent on cars to better and more housing, that would be a good thing. We thought it was there for the taking. Reducing the need for cars was particularly important for communities here like over the Rhine, which has very fine-grained and that doesn't really favor parking garages, which increase costs and compromise building design. I'm sure if you're architects in the room and planners, one of the biggest problems you have is how to work in the parking garage around a building. It never seems to work out very well, frankly, unless you put it underground. On-site residential parking garages are often underutilized, and in Cincinnati's climate, they'll eventually require major repairs that somebody's going to have to pay. When you separate housing from parking, you sort of put your thumb on the scale for better public transportation. And it helped that Cincinnati City Hall eliminated parking minimums in downtown and over the Rhine. Next slide, please. So, map of these census tracts have just come out. Census data is still pretty scarce, but I've been able to get some of it. But in this area here, streetcar lines in the red line, there are 888 new housing units built near the streetcar line. That's an increase of 13% over 2010. For Cincinnati, that's a big number. Some of it was new construction, but we're an old town, and most of it was adaptive reuse of old, obsolete office buildings and industrial buildings. Perhaps just as important, 643 units that were vacant in 2010 are now occupied by people. And many derelict and abandoned apartment buildings were brought back to life. I guess I should stop here and say that while the reinvestment and repopulation arguments were the right ones for Cincinnati, every city is different. Supporting tourism in Tampa, New Orleans and San Francisco, that's an important mission of their vintage streetcars that they have there. Commuting by streetcar is getting to be fairly common in Portland and Seattle. The modern streetcar that's about to open in Orange, California will connect two cities for the first time ever. Next slide, please. By focusing on the housing transportation linkage, we fended off the notion that this was a frivolous $148 million toy. For example, developers in downtown Cincinnati recently completed a 125-unit apartment building, Class A apartment building. Has 4 parking spaces, but there's a streetcar stop across the street. And because they didn't have to build a parking garage, it didn't require a subsidy from the city. It's the first time in my memory that a new apartment building in downtown Cincinnati did not require a cash subsidy from the city. So we talked about other benefits of car-like living. Untethered from their cars, residents would meet more of their daily needs on foot near their homes. Walking to a store or waiting at a streetcar stop would put more eyes on the street. And for a city trying to be more diverse, sharing space on a crowded streetcar was a good thing. Next slide, please. So, exactly what is a modern streetcar? The United States will soon have 16 of them. 2 are about to open in Tempe, Arizona, and in Orange County, California. The nearest one to you is in Atlanta, but there are better examples, more successful examples out there. Kansas City and Portland come to mind. In Portland and Tucson, Portland has 16 miles of track and is about to start planning for an expansion. Our streetcars hold 154 passengers, mostly standing. They have large windows, and Cincinnati streetcars are 100% low-floor and barrier-free, particularly important for people with disabilities or an elderly population. The ride is very smooth. They cost about $4 million each. Cincinnati streetcars were manufactured in Elmira, New York by a Spanish company CAF, which is a worldwide producer of high-quality rail vehicles. They were the most advanced of the 5 makes that Cincinnati considered. Along with Kansas City, we were the North American launch customer for this vehicle, and like any new product, we had problems. So did Kansas City, but those have all been resolved. Next slide, please, Rick. The project was planned and engineered by a partnership of HDR and WSP. WSP is the successor to Parsons Brinckerhoff. It's a Canadian company. It was constructed by 3 Ohio companies which had never built a streetcar before, and the workmanship is exquisite. The city finished the project on time and under budget. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, good. Cincinnati Streetcar costs about $5 million a year to operate. A private foundation that has multiple investments along the streetcar line contributes $900,000 a year to its operations. And Cincinnati Bell, our local phone company, which has just been bought, contributes $340,000 a year for naming rights. There are 18 stops, and it takes a little over 30 minutes to complete the loop if the tracks aren't blocked. More on that later. We sometimes operate 4 vehicles at a time, which gets the headways, the difference. We got some transportation folks here, but the headway is the difference between vehicles, how often they arrive. And it gets it down to about 10 or 12 minutes, which is really, really good. And that's an important point. Most times when I use a streetcar, I no longer use the transit app because it's so frequent. I just go out to the stop and one comes along. In the words of the transit planner, Jarrett Walker, frequency is freedom. And that's one thing we've been able to achieve in Cincinnati. If you have to wait, you know, the average trip on the streetcar, we believe is about a mile. You know, most people, anyone can walk that probably in 30 minutes. Most people can do it in 20. If you have to wait 20 or 25 or 30 minutes for a streetcar, I mean, most people are just going to walk, right? Next slide, please. The Cincinnati Bell Connector, as it's now known, fits well within our urban fabric. It services both the wide open areas of our riverfront, the wide down there, and also the 2 historic districts with 40-foot streets. The vehicles are large because they serve major league sports and many, many festivals, including the largest Oktoberfest in the United States. Actually, the largest in the world because Munich's was canceled. So it's Germans again. They're still around. The nature of our streetcar systems is they expand over time, and there are quiet conversations underway about where the streetcar should go next, including across the Ohio River to Newport, Kentucky. The most discussed destination is a 46,000 student University of Cincinnati. That would be the University of Cincinnati, which defeated Notre Dame last Saturday, and is now ranked, depending on the polls, 3rd, 4th, or 5th in the nation. They've had a run on their gear, by the way. You can hardly buy it anymore. Anyway, UC is about a mile north of over the Rhine, not very far. The problem is it's 250 vertical feet above the basin. So getting to UC is going to require a couple of short tunnels, which won't be cheap. But if the university and the core hospitals, which are really near the university, and the Cincinnati Zoo, which has tremendous attendance, if they get behind it, I'm guessing an extension to UC is probably in their future. Next slide, please. So, fare payment. I remember when I took that picture when the fare machine got stalled across from my house, and I put it up on Facebook, and I said, this is trouble. You know, it just was a huge barrier to acceptance. They were just too complicated for people making short trips, and there was something like a dozen choices you could make for buying bus or streetcar tickets. It was really sad to see a multi-generation family, you know, grandchildren, they had to reduce, grandparents had to reduce fare, parents paid full fare, children had to reduce fare. It was sad to see 5 or 6 people in a multi-generation family trying to figure out this ticket machine while the streetcar is bearing down on them, and the kids are screaming and crying when the streetcar leaves the station without them because they couldn't figure out the ticket machine quickly enough. So now we've made it free to passengers. So in terms of equity, I think that gets very, very high marks. I mean, it's been a good thing. I don't want to get into pluses and minuses of fare-free transit here, but the appeal of fare-free transit is growing in the United States and in Europe. Kansas City streetcars and buses are now free. Albuquerque is testing it. Los Angeles is thinking about it. It's a major issue in the election for mayor in Boston next month. Cincinnati now has some free fare days in its bus system. There's something really welcoming about free fares on transit, particularly for visitors unfamiliar with how to pay a fare. Next slide, please. Like most American cities, Cincinnati is becoming more diverse, and the passengers on the streetcar paint a demographic portrait of my city. Streetcar managers are conducting an on-ride survey right now, and they've given me a peek at the results. They're not complete, but here's what they found so far. And by the way, this is online, so I don't know how reliable it is, but it's the best we have. 47% of the passengers live along the line. it has a really dedicated group of people who use it. 61% of the people who were surveyed use it once a week. About half are under age 35. 62% earn less than $75,000 a year. And about 27% of the passengers use it to visit restaurants and bars. Naysayers, we've had a few naysayers, they like to say our streetcar isn't real transit because, they just like to say that. But here's my response. In July of this year, the latest month which comparable data are available, our streetcar carried almost 5 times as many passengers per vehicle hour as an average Cincinnati bus. To me, that seems pretty real. Next slide, please. Okay, back to the map. In the census tracts depicted here, the streetcar route, the population grew by nearly 8%, which was twice the rate of increase for the city as a whole. It was not equitable growth by race. The black population in the shaded tracts fell by 2,000 people. The white population in the shaded tracts grew by 2,000 people. There was strong growth among Hispanic and American households. While the connector gets its funds from many sources, the most equitable is, this is another tongue twister, the Voluntary Tax Incentive Contribution Agreement, or VTICA. Cincinnati typically grants up to 15-year tax abatements citywide on new construction or substantial rehabilitation that is LEED Silver or better. By written agreement, downtown and over-the-line property owners refund a share of their abatements that they receive, the value of those abatements, to a not-for-profit corporation, which then writes a check back to the city. It's crazy, but the nonprofit's in the picture so that it's not considered a tax, even though it essentially is a tax. This fund is expected to grow very fast, up to $800,000 annually by fiscal year 25, and it's a great way of capturing value from people who are benefiting, property investors who are benefiting from the presence of the streetcar. It's really a good thing. It was a clever solution. Next slide, please. Our streetcar's power. This is kind of a grim slide here, but anyway, our streetcar's power will eventually come from a solar array that's under construction on 1,000 acres of land east of Cincinnati. It's the largest city-led solar project in the nation, and it will come online in December. But the connector is not a heavy user of power. I think the bills, it pays about $80,000 a year for power, or a little over 1% of its budget. I mean, that's probably a fairly small suburban office building probably uses that much power. So it's a very efficient thing. We've studied, a city task force has studied the environmental footprint of the streetcar, and they concluded that without getting into the numbers, the major benefits come from the new settlement patterns and shared roof, shared wall construction, and people living closer together and shopping more locally. This is really black box stuff that I can't explain or defend, but it's just logical to me that people living close together and closer to their work and where they shop and traveling less in general, that's probably pretty good for the environment. Next slide, please. Give you a moment on top of that. This is a fact. Electric rail is very sustainable. But if Cincinnati's current mayor had his way, this statement would no longer be true. Our streetcar has benefited from incredible political resilience. And in a few instances along the way over the last dozen years, it's benefited from pure dumb luck. Supporters have been steadfast in advancing and defending this valuable public asset against opponents' mischief and a mayor determined to make it fail. The politics have been ugly, but the streetcar is now in a good place. And how all this played out is the remainder of my talk today. Next slide, please. Serious planning and feasibility studies of Cincinnati streetcar began in 2007. It seems ancient times. And Cincinnati City Council approved the plan with a single dissenting vote by Councilmember John Cranley, who is now mayor. Support for the plan grew. So did opposition. In 2009, anti-tax libertarians made an alliance with the NAACP and gathered enough signatures to place an issue on the ballot which mandated that citizens must vote on any rail project before the city could spend any money on it. The moment I read the ballot language they were proposing, I knew we would defeat this. Next slide, please. We quickly pointed out that no city monies, if this passed, could be spent on the city-owned National Historic Landmark Union Terminal, which serves Amtrak. Nor could the city spend any money on the children's train at the Cincinnati Zoo. Not even for the maintenance of rail crossings over city streets without a citywide vote by residents. So can you imagine that? The city wants to build a new street and has to change a rail crossing, and we have to have a citywide vote to allow that to go forward. You know, cartoonists had a lot of fun with this. I mean, there were all kinds of cartoons that appeared. Then there was a second overreach 2 years later. This time they were even more aggressive. This ballot issue said it would be illegal for the city to plan for any kind of rail for the next 10 years. Okay. You know, to me, it seemed like the streetcars, mostly suburban, a lot of these guys didn't live in the city, feared that people would get a taste of rail and they might want it extended to where they lived. Why the NAACP got sucked into this remains a puzzle. Next slide, please. Our supporters were very internet savvy, and this was the Millennials Project, and they enjoyed a social media advantage in these campaigns, usually dominating the comments pages and online polls. What's the margin here? 85 to 15, 13? Yeah, we had a lot of those. When opponents said or wrote things that weren't true, we pounced. Doing so probably made them more reluctant to post false things because they'd further undermine their credibility. Plus the back and forth in the online debates and the comments pages and the newspapers, that served to educate a wider audience that we couldn't get to. Someone would post something stupid that wasn't factual, and right away our folks would jump on them with absolutely provable statistics showing they were wrong. We really used social media well in this campaign. Next slide, please. The opponents never put up a cogent argument against the streetcar other than it costs too much and we can't afford it, even though they never submitted any evidence this was true. It was just a soundbite. These campaigns were hard fought. This was in 2009 and 2011, and we won both times. After the polls closed, we gathered at the same bar to wait out the results, and here are two photos taken at the exact moments when we realized that we had won. Next slide, please. Around the same time, newly elected Ohio Governor John Kasich rescinded a $52 million grant to extend the streetcar to the University of Cincinnati. A project was the highest rated among 300 projects in the state of Ohio competing for that grant. It was the highest rated project not by politicians, but by transportation professionals, highway people, transit people looking at it. They felt it would have the highest ratio of benefits over costs. The Tea Party got to Kasich. Next slide, please. So, learning this, Cincinnati city manager asked to meet with me, and said he was considering bailing on the project. My advice to him was, don't let this get you down, just build what you can build. And so, next slide please, we lopped off the university extension and we soldiered on. And on a sunny afternoon in February of 2012, Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood and Federal Transportation Administrator Peter Rogoff came to Cincinnati for a groundbreaking. Important to note here that Mayor Mallory, again, who's in the center with the shovel, he had planned to dedicate the city's share of a new downtown casino under construction to pay for streetcar operations. But Mallory's plan was never formalized by an audience, and this would later prove to be a serious problem. And we had this all figured out. We're going to use the casino profits. Since they got a share of those, I guess for granting zoning permission or something, I can't recall, but it would have been enough to fund the streetcar, and we thought that was covered, but it was never became an ordinance. Next slide, please. Mayor Mallory was term limited, and former Mayor Roxanne Qualls decided to run for mayor again in 2013. Opposing her was former city council member John Cranley, a smart, able politician fiercely opposed to the idea of urban rail. He made his campaign all about opposition to the streetcar and Mayor Mallory's plan to privatize city parking assets. Roxanne supported both of these. Cranley won decisively, and the day after the election said, "The streetcar conversation is over." He said this after vehicle assembly was well underway and about a half-mile of track had been constructed. In his first act as mayor, he rounded up enough votes to stop streetcar construction. Next slide, please. Cranley's aggressive stance brought out support we never knew we had. On the afternoon of his inauguration, we rallied in front of Cincinnati's Music Hall and over 1,000 supporters turned out. We lined the half-mile construction with people holding these green balloons. Our visual protest re-energized streetcar supporters and captured the attention of Cincinnatians. Cincinnati's vice mayor, who had actually been opposed to the project, has since come around, but he was a very serious guy. He's actually running for mayor now. He asked for an audit to determine which contracts could be broken, construction contracts could be broken, and what the resulting costs would be. City Hall hired KPMG, the accounting firm, to perform an audit which took a couple weeks at a cost of $250,000. It was a total waste of money, but it was a godsend because it gave us time to organize. We quickly secured financial commitments to pay for our own ballot initiative, which would force the city council and the mayor to complete the project. We retained the top signature gathering firm in Ohio to undertake this for us. After seeing our level of support, they said, "You don't want to hire us to do this. With your level of support, just do this yourselves. It'll come off better to the voters." So we did. Next slide, please. Before Crandley even took office, the Federal Transit Administration warned City Hall that if the project were abandoned, it would demand immediate repayment of the $45 million FTA had granted to the project. And if repayment wasn't prompt, it would begin a collection action against the city of Cincinnati to get its $45 million back. They were playing hardball. Our attorney opened a line of communication with the feds to let them know what we were doing. Now we really had a tiger by the tail. We held our first strategy meeting with supporters in a church along the streetcar line. That meeting was open to the public, even a number of the opponents attended, but we had nothing to hide. This was a public process. Next slide, please. Supporters checked out 1,000 barcoded petitions and sent out with their clipboards far and wide. During an 8-day period in a snowy December, you saw people on street corners and offices and restaurants getting signatures. I had a New York Times reporter follow me around one Saturday morning as I collected signatures. We tracked each petition and checked the signatures for validity as soon as they were turned in, so we always knew where we stood. Next slide, please. Imagine waking up to this on a Sunday morning. I did, and it sort of focused our attention on what we had to do in the week ahead. City Council held 3 days of public testimony on whether or not to cancel the project, and supporters flooded City Hall. Council members opposed to the streetcar project listened to arguments, once opposed to the streetcar project, listened to arguments they had never heard before. Momentum began to swing to our side as one by one, they realized that cancellation would be very foolish. Next slide, please. On the morning of the fourth day, sounds kind of dramatic, KPMG delivered its report, which included it would cost almost as much to cancel the project as it would to complete it. And they didn't try to put a number on the damages to Cincinnati's reputation, which would have been huge. Remember, we're the ones with a half-finished subway project under downtown Cincinnati. At the end of the meeting, we announced we had collected 11,000 signatures in 8 days. Way more than enough to qualify our ballot issues for a special election, which we would have won. Next slide, please. That afternoon, you want to go back? Okay. Something is out of order here. Okay. Go forward another slide. One more. Okay. Go back a couple, please. Yeah, go back now. One got left out. Okay, so that afternoon, Mayor Crandley called a news conference. His first words were, "We're going to have a streetcar." City Council then passed a veto-proof ordinance which obligated the city to complete and operate the Cincinnati streetcar. There was an economic cost to Crandley's foolishness. Pausing streetcar constructing, demobilizing the construction workers, and restarting the construction added $2 million to the cost of the project. Okay, you want forward now? Okay. But His Honor wasn't finished messing with our streetcar project. You recall that his predecessor, Mayor Mallory, wanted to dedicate the city's share of casino profits to operate the streetcar each year. Crandley took that source of funds away and spent it on something else. By doing so, he planted the seeds of an ongoing annual crisis of how to fund the streetcar operations. Next slide, please. Well, we completed the streetcar construction without a hitch. And at a ceremony in front of Music Hall, where we rallied to save the project 3 years earlier, the streetcar opened in September of 2016 to great fanfare and strong initial ridership. But success was short-lived. Next slide, please. The Cranley administration failed to get the vehicles in good working order. I think the low point was the slide on the left. Turned out our streetcars wouldn't operate in very cold weather, and in this particular case, one had to be towed all the way through downtown and back to the car barn and over the Rhine with this monster tow truck at noon. And again, if there was worse press that the project could have had, I'm not sure what it would have been. Cranley also allowed the tracks to be blocked hundreds of times a month. They literally did not enforce the parking rules against parking on the tracks. A program to retime the downtown and over the Rhine street lights to smooth the streetcars past to give it a hold green function so it could get through intersections faster. That was started and abruptly stopped. I guess it was too successful. The system became unreliable and ridership cratered. The city eventually cured the problems with the vehicles and doubled the fine for blocking the tracks, and ridership started to grow. Then the pandemic struck. Cranley shut down the streetcar for health reasons, even though almost every other city continued to operate its streetcars during the pandemic. I think one or two maybe modern streetcar projects closed down. To stave off another threat by the feds to claw back its $45 million, Cranley proposed, this is crazy, spending $3 million a year to operate a zombie streetcar running laps around downtown and over the Rhine but carrying no passengers. Cincinnatians were generally appalled by this idea. Everything started to come to a head in June of 2020 as Cincinnati worked its way through a very contentious budget process. You recall the events of 2020, the tragic events of 2020. There was tremendous debates of whether in Cincinnati to defund the police, and if so, by how much, and how much to spend on increased social programs. We actually did that, but the streetcar got caught up in all that. Supporters testified, wrote, emailed, and phoned council members demanding a restart. Residents and business owners shared how they had reconfigured their lives and their livelihoods around the streetcar line. Council voted against Cranley to restart streetcar service. Next slide, please. Cranley immediately vetoed the motion, and the zombie streetcar continued to operate the rest of the summer without passengers. When council returned from its summer recess, a member presented another plan for funding streetcar operations. These were all legit plans. There was nothing controversial about them. Cranley vetoed that too. A frustrated city council then overrode Cranley's veto and made the streetcar free to use, they say, forever. I'm sure when Cranley started down this road, he never expected things to turn out the way they did. With Cranley leaving office next year, early next year, he's running for governor of Ohio, by the way, the political climate of the streetcar is almost certain to improve. The project is moving forward and not looking back. It's competently managed and supporters are still very energized. Even with less activity in downtown, ridership is growing. We just had the strongest September ever since the opening month. Among the candidates for mayor and city council in next month's city election, the streetcar for the first time in a dozen years barely registers in the conversation among the candidates. It's well accepted by city residents now. Take a moment, next slide please. So these are the first two sentences from the executive summary of HDR's benefit cost study which justify the streetcar project. Remember I talked earlier about having defined objectives? So how do we do? Based on building permit data, there has been $1.4 billion in property investment within 1,000 feet of the 18 streetcar stops between the 2012 groundbreaking and the end of 2019. Now, in Florida cities, that's probably not a lot of investment, not a big deal. For Cincinnati, that's a big deal, particularly when, we went, I think, 15 or 20 years when no Class A office building was built in downtown, maybe longer than that. Significantly, this is what's really interesting. This sum of money, $1.4 billion, is 4 times the amount of money that was spent outside the 1,000-foot radius around the streetcar line in all of downtown and all of over the Rhine, which is a much, much larger area. So the streetcar appears to have had some influence on that. Population along the streetcar line is up, although there has been significant displacement due to gentrification. There's more housing and more formerly vacant housing has been occupied. The streetcar, its role now is sort of a force multiplier of a lot of efforts for downtown going forward, and it's going to become more important as downtown and over the Rhine continue to repopulate. Parking lots, as you know, will become building sites, and parking will become less available and much more expensive. And as feeding a car becomes less affordable, the streetcar will serve a very important purpose going forward. Next slide, please. So, what did we learn? Well, a few things. If you're going to, and I'm going to speak about rail projects, but I think that a lot of this is applicable to any large public project, whatever it would be, in terms of how to sort of sustain its life and to make it a success. The first thing is find a champion for the long run. A champion who is financially independent. That doesn't mean rich. It means someone who doesn't work for a big corporation, who gets called into the boss's office one day, and he or she is told, I had a call from a board member, and this streetcar thing is kind of controversial. We don't think you should be spending so much time on it. It's not a good thing for our company. And by the way, you're doing so well on your job, we're going to promote you to the office in Denver. You really need somebody that is there for the long run, who's the institutional memory, who can sort of shepherd this project along and always be sort of the go-to person that people can get answers from. In Cincinnati's case, it was me, but there's somebody like me in every city that I know of that's done this type of project. At the same time, you really need to encourage other voices. I'll give you an example. In the 2013 showdown with Cranley over stopping the project, a young man named Ryan Messer, who was leader of the LGBTQ community and had just with his partner bought a house on the streetcar line, stepped forward and he said, hey, my net worth is tied up in this house. This is really going to, he had no parking, this is really going to mess me up if you do this. He brought in a whole new group of young people that really had never been engaged in this, and he became the public face of that campaign. And we all worked together on it, but again, it just had a new face to it. And that happened a number of times, that when different challenges arose, different people stepped forward to lend their voices, and that's really important. You need to get in the regional transportation plan. I was talking to Roya earlier about the MPOs. Recall when we had our light rail initiative voted on in 2002. That was 50 miles of light rail and a downtown streetcar and a bus vote. After that was over, and we were just crushed. After that was over, we went to the MPO and we said, look, the downtown streetcar was actually very popular. It won by 2-1. You need to leave that in the plan. And they resisted a little bit, but I think they kind of threw us a bone, and they left it in the plan. And that was really important because since that was in the plan, it made us eligible for federal funds. Had that not been in the plan, we might have never gotten the $45 million, and this project would have never been built. You need to determine who could advance or block your project. Right now, I'm telling people not to talk about streetcar expansion much because it'll just put up a target for Cranley to throw darts at, and there's just no reason to do it because nothing's going to happen as long as he's mayor. But you need to kind of look down the field like a good quarterback and figure out who's coming up. Right now, I'm trying to discern the new council candidates who are running and what their support would be, and hopefully even if they don't win this time, they may win in the future. But I think these projects are so long-lived. I mean, literally in every city, they take at least 10 years, it seems. Unless you're Portland or someplace like that, they seem to get anything done. You just need to kind of figure out who are going to be your key people, years down the road. Become a reliable expert. This is so important. In a Midwestern city like Cincinnati, which never, had rail, but hasn't had it in many years, reporters don't know the subject matter. Supporters sometimes don't know the subject matter. You need to really have people who can talk with authority and come up with specifics and studies to prove your arguments. That's really kind of key, and if you don't have the credibility of the news media, it'll really hurt. So I think whatever these projects are, you need to be credible. Capitalize on opponents' mistakes. This is so important. It's been Gary, Tim Eyman in Washington, he's one of the sole persons who's kind of stayed in the game many, many years, but generally these people who oppose these projects, whether it's rail or something else, they tend to be kind of gadflies, flash in the pans. They will come and go. They like the spotlight. It gives them attention. A lot of times they'll do it because they're going to run for office, and if they can be the main anti to something, that gives them credibility. In this case, one of the opponents put up a picture on Facebook of an old-time streetcar. I don't know what city it was in, with about 20 or 25 African American men hanging off the sides of the streetcar in the front of it. And I suppose this was supposed to look threatening to people. That was kind of what, he put it up. He was smashed in the press. The media criticized it, everybody. We never heard from that guy again. And he just, and we capitalized on that. We kind of said, here are the kind of folks that oppose this project. This is why they oppose it. So you need to be able to pounce on that. That's really kind of key when and they will make mistakes. Most of the people that oppose these projects are not politically trained. They're not very astute. They're not media trained, and they will really make a lot of mistakes, and you need to jump on it. This is tell citizens how the built environment can change. This is one thing I think we didn't do a good job at, and I think I in particular didn't do a good job. Running a 78,000 pound, 77-foot long streetcar down a street, which is used by bikes and buses and cars and trucks, is going to have an effect, right? And I don't think we did a very good job of preparing the city for that effect. We just sort of assumed that, Roxanne Qualls would be mayor and she would make whatever changes are possible. But, in the case of streetcars, you need to create lanes, you need to have heavy fines for blocking the tracks, you need to retimer signals. And again, I don't think we prepared people for how this would change their environment. I think that was a mistake that we made. And then finally, and most important, think of all the things in life that you hate. What you had for breakfast, what bar you went to last night, your second grade teacher, a former spouse, I don't know, maybe where you went to college, maybe. The point is, people cannot sustain hate. My guess is if you ever hated anything in your life, it lasted a day or a week or a month or maybe a year, and then it's over. Now think of things you love. Your spouse, your family, your church, where you went to college, what you like to eat, where you like to travel. Those things endure. And generally my point here is that love will conquer hate every time. And people who are behind these projects, they tend to love them and sustain that love a lot more than the haters will hate them, and they will eventually win. So, in conclusion, Cincinnati streetcar opponents, they wrote the book on how to cripple a rail transit project. Fortunately, their authors were poor leaders, and their tactics were random and unorganized. Rail supporters, on the other hand, stuck with the project in thick and thin and carried the day. And as times change, people change. The most ironic thing here, the streetcar's most effective opponent, a real gentleman, has since purchased property a few steps from a busy streetcar stop. So again, times change. The constellations have aligned to end my city's 70 years of depopulation. We've restored a historic, beautiful neighborhood. We are boosting our riverfront. And we're better connecting assets that Cincinnatians have invested in for almost 200 years. Cincinnati has a good story to tell these days, and we have more chapters to write. This concludes my presentation. I want to thank you so much for inviting me to come down here. I love your city, and I'll take any questions that you have. Thanks again.
Were the traffic signals eventually retimed?
They started in Over Rhine, and they retimed those, and the streetcar flies through Over the Rhine. In downtown, I think they kind of saw how successful it was, and he stopped the project in downtown. And it's sort of slow going in downtown. But it generally works. People know it works, and I think with the new mayor, we'll probably get the whole project done. They have 4 or 5 more to do.
Are the traffic signals timed right now so motorists can get to the interstates and back out to the burbs? Is that what?
This is a guy that knows Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Cincinnati, like most cities, was designed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to funnel traffic to the freeways. That's what it did, right? And in Cincinnati, that's on the east-west basis. But guess what? In our city, what's happened is we've expanded to the south about 4 blocks to the new riverfront. There's tremendous attractions down there, especially the sports teams. And we've expanded more to the north into Over the Rhine. There's many more attractions up now there than there used to be. So while our traffic patterns are gauged to get people moving out of town and in town as quickly as possible, the growth in the city is in north-south directions, that areas that had not been developed. And so, and everybody will benefit from this. Their cars drive on the same streets, so to rebalance the signals to allow this expansion of downtown, which has been taking place, that's a good thing. And we'll eventually get it done. I'm sure we'll do that. What we're mainly doing is a whole green function, where the streetcar approaches a traffic light. The driver can send a radio signal to the light and hold it open green for I don't know how many seconds he has to be away. I think 7 seconds or something like that, and pass through the intersection. And our argument was, the streetcar is not the only thing that's going through that green light. A lot of cars are going to go through it too at the same time. So again, I think reasonable people understand it's a good thing, and we'll get it done eventually.
And then I also want to ask you about the issue of displacement that you mentioned. There has been, unfortunately, some displacement. When I toured over the Rhine with part of the last CNU national conference, we went from Louisville to over the Rhine to tour it. And we were hosted by 3CDC, is that how it's stated? And it was amazing what the transformation of this urban neighborhood from my childhood to what I saw was mind-boggling. It was the most mind-boggling transformation I could imagine. And then when I see a Grader's ice cream parlor in over the Rhine, that just told me right there, this is a community for everyone, for families. You take your kids to Grader's. That was just remarkable. And then the other point I wanted to raise was 3CDC took us to some of their different redevelopments, and there is below market housing that's all mixed in with market rate housing. You cannot tell the difference from the outside, what's market rate and what's below market rate. These are these beautiful, and you saw some of the architecture in there, these buildings from the late 1800s to early 1900s. What is the architectural style? Anyone is it?
Italianate, yeah.
It just phenomenal from the outside. Walk in on the and they have this wonderful urban grid to be able to see. So if you're ever up in that part of the world, it really is worth seeing. But I hope we have we gain some lessons for future battles that we're sure to have here in Florida. It was just so important to hear this story. So let me just open it up to any yeah, sure.
When Rick and Roy first asked me to speak about this, particularly on the subject of equity, I was a little reluctant because I thought I'm not going to have much census information available by the time you want me to talk. I'm going to have raw population counts by race. I'm not going to have any figures by income or anything else, or family size, or things that you all would be into in a major way. But it is a problem Cincinnati is going to have to deal with. I mean, 2,000 fewer black residents over the Rhine, 2,000 more white residents. That's a stark fact that everybody in town knows and has been talking about, and we're going to have to figure out what's going on here. My sense is that we're, like a lot of cities, and I've been reading this about the census, small households are replacing larger households. That's basically what's happening. I mean, developers are buying some of these buildings that probably had, a couple, 3, 4 bedroom apartments in them, and they're making 1 and 2 bedroom apartments out of them, or smaller. And I think this is going to be a deep dive that in our city is going to go on for years to figure out what exactly has happened and what the remedies ought to be. I think we're doing a good job with building affordable housing. The city is funding more and more of it, but those facts. I mean, facts are facts. Those are bad numbers that I think no city would be proud of, and hopefully we can get our arms around what the solutions are.
So let me open it up to all of you. Any thoughts or questions that you may have? I'm going to go all the way to the back. If you could just introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm John Berry from St. Petersburg. I wonder if you could just backtrack and explain, elaborate a little bit more on a 1,000-acre solar farm in the context of a 3.6-mile streetcar line. And I didn't quite understand how all that comes together.
Yeah, that solar farm will provide 25% of the total power used in the city of Cincinnati. total, and 100% of the municipal city power, the government power in the city of Cincinnati. So yeah, that's I can see why you would think that. I thought it was kind of weird, but the idea is Cincinnati is, as a, let me be charitable here, as an old industrial town, it has its share of green fields and it has its share of smokestacks, but we're doing a pretty good job, I think, of trying to clean up our act, particularly in comparison to some other cities in the Midwest. And, this is one thing, frankly, that I admire John Cranley for. He pioneered that project. He got it. He's getting it done. So, I think that's a good thing. And right now, 25% of the people in the city, through aggregation of our power, do buy green power, and this will basically substitute from a closer source, I guess, for those 25% of the people. And there may be more of them at some point. I don't know if it's expandable or not, but it's a good thing we're doing. I'm proud of our city that we're doing that.
I'm Gary Lawrence with WGI. Excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that. We talked earlier about my time in Seattle when I was a planning director and working with the MPO on the streetcar that was done there. And one of the strategies was always to make sure that the streetcar connected to light rail that connected to heavy rail, so you could actually get from your home to Vancouver or Portland without having to get in a car. How does your streetcar connect to the rest of the intercity kinds of systems?
Great question, and we really do it well. And the streetcar, we have a bus hub in downtown Cincinnati that's a block long. We have 400-foot blocks where basically all the region's transportation assets sort of come together either in those bus shelters or on the streets immediately around there. The streetcar passes tangent to each end of that block, and you'll see commuters getting off the bus and distributing themselves through downtown and over the Rhine. So my answer to you is we do a great job of that. Our Amtrak is in Union Terminal, which is about a mile from downtown. It doesn't connect to that. Some people would like to. I don't, it's one train, 3 trains a week. I don't think it's probably worth doing. But I think we do a good job, and because it's free, it's kind of a seamless transfer. I mean, people get off the bus and just get on the streetcar, so it's a good thing. Even when the streetcar was charged a fare of $1, 10% of the passengers came from the bus system. They're not tracking that anymore because because they did through their tickets. There's no way to track it anymore. So I just noticed during the day, in the early morning, I see a pretty good surge of people going away from Government Square up and over the Rhine. So I think we're doing a pretty good job of that, I believe. By the way, I neglected, and I should have said this because I'm a bus rider, but I actually do have a car that I drove 972 miles last year. I'm kind of embarrassed by that. But anyway, we just passed an 8/10 of 1% sales tax last year to massively increase our bus system. I mean, I don't know how many new routes, 7 new routes, 24/7 service on 7 routes, bus hubs in neighborhoods so people don't have to come all the way downtown and then go all to transfer and go all the way back out again. So we're not just concerned about a streetcar in Cincinnati. We've made a massive commitment to our bus system for a 25-year tax to really beef it up. So we're kind of looking at this whole thing here, not just the streetcar.
And you talked a lot about John Cranley, and I'm no fan of John Cranley, but I guess one good thing he did do was to help to fund and increase an expansion of bicycling infrastructure, including the Wasson Way, and I think there's a cycle track that comes down the Central Parkway over the Rhine from Clifton, which is a very old line beautiful neighborhood up in the hills, as you can imagine from the name there. Is there any back and forth of people riding their bikes that get on the streetcar?
Yeah, you occasionally see a bike on the streetcar. By the way, the cynics would tell you that the Wasson Raid Trail, which would have been an excellent streetcar line, Cranley put bikes on it, knowing with federal funds, knowing that once it became a bike path, it could never be used for anything else. I won't say if I'm one of those cynics or not, but it is a beautiful trail that will connect the University of Cincinnati eventually to the far eastern suburbs of Cincinnati, about maybe 9 miles, and it's it's a great thing. And the cyclists in town, I think, generally cyclists never feel they have enough infrastructure, so they're a little critical of Cranley. But he has made some things happen in that area, including a red bike system. You probably have those here. Our bike rental system is really robust. You see them all over town. It's constantly expanding, not only in Cincinnati, but across the river in Covington and Newport, Kentucky. So, yeah, I credit him with a lot of that.
I think we've exhausted our questions this morning. So, John, thanks so much for coming down.
Thank you very much. And if you ever come up to Cincinnati, you can probably find me on Facebook, and I'd love to show you around. It really is. I mean, everybody loves their city, but we really have done some great things that I think are worth showing off. And you know, I think in the future we're going to be a survivor, and I think a thriver. And so I hope you all come sometime. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John, for coming down here and giving an excellent presentation and sharing your story. Your lessons learned can definitely be applied here. So everyone, don't go too far. We have a really short break, and next up we have our Sustainable Best Practices panel. That'll be starting in about 15 minutes at 11 o'clock. So you have a little break to grab some coffee, and we have some snacks in the other room as well. Thank you.